There is a truth about human nature as uncomfortable as it is liberating. All hatred is a confession. Think of the person you despise most in the world. That politician, that family member, that archetype of a person who makes your blood boil. Now, imagine that the intensity of your contempt is directly proportional to the depth of a truth you refuse to admit about yourself. What you condemn most furiously on the world's stage is, almost always, the ghost you have chained in the basement of your soul. We call this ghost the shadow, and the mechanism that makes it haunt. The faces of others, projection. This is not a video about cheap psychology or superficial self-help. This is an autopsy of the soul, a journey to the epicenter of your conflicts, your anxieties, and that persistent feeling that you are fighting against the world when, in fact, the war has always been internal. In the next few minutes, we will dismantle the most powerful self-deception mechanism of the human psyche. You are about to understand why you sabotage your relationships, why you feel like an imposter, and why you keep repeating the same destructive patterns, no matter how much you try to change. If this introduction has already sent a shiver of recognition down your spine, do not ignore the sign. This is the call from your own depths. To continue on this journey, I need a commitment from you. Subscribing to this channel is not just a click, it is your enrollment in a modern mystery school. Your decision to stop being a spectator in your life and become its architect. Your like is not for the algorithm. It is an act of saying yes to this truth, anchoring it in your consciousness. And your comment. Comment the word mirror if you have had the courage to recognize, even for a second, a reflection of yourself in the hatred you feel for someone. Do this now, before we dive deeper, to seal your commitment to your own transformation. The journey begins now. In the grand theater of our consciousness, each of us plays a carefully rehearsed role, our persona. It is the social mask we present to the world, composed of all the qualities we have learned to value: kindness, intelligence, competence, generosity. Since childhood, we are trained by our parents, teachers, and culture itself to identify and nurture these luminous traits. However, the human psyche, in its totality, is like the planet itself. For every hemisphere bathed in sunlight, there is another plunged into darkness. The shadow is this hidden continent, this nocturnal hemisphere of our personality. It is not inherently evil, like a fairy tale antagonist. It is, simply, the other side. It is the vast repository of everything that, for one reason or another, was considered inadequate, unacceptable, or dangerous to our idealized self-image. It is the aggression we had to repress to be nice, the vulnerability we hid to appear strong, the laziness we denied to be productive, the envy we masked with disdain. But the shadow holds more than just flaws. It is also home to undeveloped talents, suffocated passions, a wild creativity, and an instinctual vitality that did not fit into the narrow mold of our upbringing. This is the gold in the shadow, the raw psychic energy that, being too intense, was also exiled. The shadow is, in essence, our unlived twin, the potential we sacrificed at the altar of social acceptance. The fundamental problem is that psychic energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed or repressed. By denying the existence of this inner continent, we do not make it disappear. We only make it autonomous. The shadow begins to live a life of its own in the unconscious, operating beyond our control, gaining strength with each denial, feeding on every judgment we make. It becomes a reactive force that erupts in moments of stress, fatigue, or intoxication, manifesting in slips of the tongue, Freudian slips, and bursts of anger that surprise and shame us. I don't know what came over me, we say, not realizing that the one who spoke was the exile, the inhabitant of the other side, crying out for recognition. The process of individuation, the path to wholeness proposed by Jung, is not a quest for perfection, but an active reunification. It is the courageous journey of descending into our own underworld, not to defeat what dwells there, but to dialogue, to understand, and finally, to integrate. It is a process of rescue, of bringing back into consciousness the parts of ourselves that were fragmented and exiled, recognizing that true strength lies not in being only light, but in having the capacity to consciously contain our own darkness. To deny the shadow is to condemn oneself to a life of fragility, always afraid that the mask might fall. To embrace it is the path to unshakable authenticity, where there is nothing left to hide and, therefore, nothing to fear. If the shadow is the forbidden film we keep in the psyche's basement, projection is the mechanism that secretly screens it for us every night. It is the soul's cinema projector, unable or unwilling to watch this film internally, which would require admitting this is me, our mind, in an act of brilliant self-deception, turns the projector outward and uses the world and its people as its screens. It is one of the most primitive and effective defense mechanisms we possess. It allows us to externalize an internal conflict, transforming a civil war into a battle against an external enemy. It is infinitely more comfortable to hate the arrogance in a co-worker than to confront the seed of the same arrogance within ourselves. It is easier to judge a friend's fakeness than to admit our own inauthenticities. Projection, therefore, alleviates the tension of cognitive dissonance. It keeps our self-image, our persona, intact and immaculate. The process is subtle and almost always unconscious. It begins with a hook. The person who becomes our screen usually possesses, in fact, a minimal trace of the characteristic we project. The small, real hook allows us to hang the entire heavy coat of our shadow on them. A person who is slightly disorganized can become, in our eyes, the personification of chaos and irresponsibility. If these are qualities we fiercely repress in ourselves, an assertive person can be seen as an aggressive tyrant if we do not allow ourselves to express our own strength. The phenomenon is marked by a disproportionate emotional charge. The anger, irritation, or, conversely, the admiration and idealization, the projection of the golden shadow, are too intense for the actual situation. This excessive energy is the sign that something of our own has been activated. We are not just reacting to the person in front of us, we are reacting to a repudiated part of ourselves that they represent. Thus, we live in a haunted world, not by external ghosts, but by our own internal exiles. Every judgment we issue is a boomerang. Every finger we point has 3 others pointing back at us. The world becomes a fragmented mirror, where each person reflects a piece of our inner puzzle that we refuse to assemble. This poisons relationships, as we stop interacting with real people and start fighting our own caricatures. The other is forced to carry the burden of our darkness, to play a role in our internal drama without ever having received the script. The only way out of this prison of mirrors is the practice of radical self-reflection. It is the act of, at the height of an emotional reaction, stopping and asking, what, exactly, is bothering me so much? Where does this same characteristic, perhaps in a different form or to a lesser degree, exist within me? This question is the key that turns off the projector. It brings the focus back inside, from where it should never have left. It is a painful path, as it requires us to abdicate the self-righteous pleasure of being right and blaming the other. But it is the only path to perceptual freedom, the only way to clean the lenses of our vision and, finally, begin to see the world and people as they really are, and not as extensions of our own unconscious drama. Just as the body shows signs of a fever to warn of an infection, the psyche produces clear symptoms when the projection mechanism is active and inflamed. Learning to read these signs is like acquiring a new sense, an ability to see the hidden gears behind the stage of our emotions. The first and most obvious symptom is a disproportionate emotional reaction. You find yourself exploding with anger over a colleague's minor mistake, or feeling an overwhelming wave of contempt for a trivial comment someone made on social media. The intensity of your emotion is a clear indicator that the external event was just the trigger. The gunpowder was already stored inside you. This excessive energy belongs to the shadow. You are not angry about what the person did, but about what their action represents and mirrors in you. It is an anger that comes from a part of you that feels judged, exposed, or threatened. The second sign is generalization and black and white thinking. When we are projecting, the target person ceases to be a complex individual and becomes the embodiment of a single, negative trait. He is always like that. She is the most selfish person I know. We use absolutisms because we are not describing a person, but an archetype of our shadow. This gross oversimplification of reality is a defense mechanism to justify the intensity of our judgment. Seeing the person in their entirety, with qualities and flaws, would make the projection unsustainable. The third symptom, more subtle, is the compulsion to gossip and recruit allies. The need to speak ill of the target person to others serves two purposes. First, it seeks external validation for our judgment, trying to convince ourselves and others that our perception is objective. Second, it is an attempt to exorcise the dark characteristic by creating a social consensus against it. Gossip, in this context, is a form of collective projection, a ritual to strengthen the group's persona and marginalize the shared shadow. A fourth revealing sign is obsessive fascination or repulsion. You find yourself constantly thinking about the person, stewing over their actions, stalking their profiles. This focused and obsessive psychic energy indicates that the person has become a powerful symbol. For your unconscious, they represent something you desperately need to understand about yourself, whether it's a flaw you deny repulsion or a potential you dare not live. Fascination and idealization, the projection of the golden shadow. Finally, the deepest sign is a sense of moral self-righteousness. When projecting, we feel virtuous. Condemning the lazy, the arrogant, or the immoral gives us a temporary feeling of superiority. We feel clean and correct in comparison. This ego inflation is a direct compensation for the part of us that feels the exact opposite. The louder our moral crusade against the flaws of others, the more desperately we are trying to silence the voice of our own shadow. Recognizing these signs in real time requires a constant practice of self-observation. It's like being a detective of your own soul, treating every intense emotional reaction not as a truth about the world, but as a clue about your own unexplored territory. Intimate relationships, whether romantic, familial, or deep friendships, are the alchemical cauldrons where shadow projection manifests most intensely and devastatingly. Proximity and intimacy lower the persona's defenses, creating the perfect environment for the unconscious contents of both partners to surface and collide. At the beginning of a romantic relationship, for example, what predominates is the projection of the golden shadow and the animus archetype. We project onto the other our ideal qualities, our unlived potential, the image of our soul. We see the other not as they are, but as the personification of everything we lack. This is the infatuation phase, a form of mutual and beneficial possession that creates the initial bond. However, this phase is unsustainable. As daily life reveals the partner's real humanity, with their flaws and idiosyncrasies, the golden projections begin to withdraw. It is at this moment that the dark shadow, previously repressed, finds its space. The same mechanism that once idealized now begins to demonize. The person who was the savior becomes the tormentor. The partner who was perfect now seems to be the source of all our frustration. Minor habits become monumental character flaws. What is happening is that each individual begins to project onto the other the parts of themselves they have failed to integrate. The person who represses their anger may start to see their partner as overly aggressive. The one who fears their own dependency may accuse the other of being needy and suffocating. The relationship transforms into a battlefield for unresolved internal wars. Every argument about dirty dishes or finances is, in reality, an argument about power, control, freedom, fear of abandonment, the great themes of the shadow. The partner becomes a convenient scapegoat for our own unhappiness and dissatisfaction with life. "I would be happy if you would just change" becomes the toxic mantra that echoes in silence. This dynamic creates a vicious cycle of accusation and defense, where no one takes responsibility for their own emotional baggage. The relationship stagnates, as the energy that could be used for individual and mutual growth is spent on a blame game. Breaking this cycle requires immense courage from both sides. It requires each person to withdraw their projections, to stop using the other as a screen. This means looking at one's own irritation and asking, what is this attitude of my partner's mirroring about my own shadow, about my fears and unhealed wounds? It means taking responsibility for one's own happiness and stopping the placement of this impossible burden on the other's shoulders. When this happens, true intimacy becomes possible. Intimacy is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to use conflict as a mirror for self-knowledge. The partner ceases to be an intimate enemy and becomes an ally on the journey of individuation, the most honest and, at times, most painful mirror we can find. It is the moment when the relationship transcends need and becomes a conscious choice, based on the acceptance of wholeness, both one's own and the other's. The Jungian perspective on the shadow is radically different from conventional morality. While most systems of thought instruct us to repress, combat, or eliminate our negative traits, depth psychology invites us to face them as guardians of a treasure. The shadow is not psychic waste to be discarded, but an unexplored gold mine. The famous alchemist Paracelsus stated, "Where you find your poison, you will also find your remedy." This is the essence of shadow work. Every characteristic we have exiled to the darkness of the unconscious has taken with it an immense amount of psychic energy and valuable potential. The task of the inner hero is not to slay the dragon, but to confront it to rescue the treasure it guards. Let's look at concrete examples. Aggression, so feared and repressed, especially in women, is the guardian of assertiveness. The ability to set boundaries, to say no, and to fight for what one believes in. When repressed, it transforms into passive aggressiveness, psychosomatic illnesses, or explodes in uncontrolled fury. When integrated, it becomes a vital force for self-preservation and achievement in the world. Laziness, seen as a cardinal sin in our productivist culture, can be the guardian of introspection, of necessary rest, of the ability to simply be instead of constantly doing. The person who judges themselves as lazy may be suppressing a contemplative side, a slower, more organic rhythm that their soul needs. Envy, perhaps the most shameful emotion to admit, is a distorted compass pointing to our deepest, unfulfilled desires. Instead of hating the person who is what we want, envy, when examined honestly, reveals what we need to seek for ourselves. It can be the catalyst that drives us to develop our own talents and pursue our own dreams. Sensuality and instincts, often repressed by religious or moral dogmas, guard our vitality, our creativity, and our connection to the body and to nature. Repressing them turns us into arid, disconnected, and overly mental beings. Integrating them returns to us the joy of living, spontaneity, and passion. The process of rescuing this gold begins with the suspension of moral judgment. One must approach the shadow with the curiosity of a naturalist, not the condemnation of a judge. Dialoguing with these parts through dreams, active imagination, or art allows them to reveal their function and purpose. By asking our laziness what it really wants, we might discover it yearns for peace. By asking our anger what it is defending, we might find a core value that is being violated. This work of integration is what Jung called the union of opposites, coniunctio oppositorum, the central goal of psychological alchemy. It is a process that makes us more whole, more paradoxical, and therefore more resilient. We cease to be a single note and become a complex chord. The result is not perfection, but wholeness. And in wholeness resides a strength and an authenticity that the persona, no matter how polished, can never offer. The dynamic of the shadow and projection does not operate only at the individual level. It manifests powerfully and dangerously in the collective unconscious. Just as an individual has a persona and a shadow, so do groups, nations, and cultures develop an idealized collective identity and, consequently, a collective shadow. The collective shadow is composed of all the characteristics that a group refuses to recognize in itself: its capacity for violence, its intolerance, its greed, its historical failures. To maintain the group's cohesion and preserve its virtuous self-image, we are the good, the just, the civilized. This collective shadow must be projected outward. The target of this massive projection is the scapegoat. Historically, this role has been played by ethnic or religious minorities or by other nations. The other is transformed into a screen for all the fears and flaws of the dominant group. They are demonized, caricatured, and dehumanized, becoming the repository for all the darkness the group cannot admit in itself. This mechanism is the psychological root of racism, xenophobia, religious persecution, and genocide. By projecting its shadow onto a scapegoat, the group feels purified and justified in its acts of aggression. Violence against the other is seen not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of cleansing, of eradicating evil. We saw this in Nazi Germany, where the Jews became the screen for the German shadow, carrying projections of greed, conspiracy, and impurity. We see it today in extreme political polarization, where each side projects its shadow onto the other. The political opponent ceases to be a compatriot with different ideas. and becomes the embodiment of absolute evil, corruption, stupidity, and treason. Social media has become the great arena for this war of collective projections. Algorithms create bubbles that reinforce the group's virtuous self-image and amplify the demonization of the other, making dialogue and empathy nearly impossible. The individual, within the group, feels absolved of personal responsibility. Collective projection offers a sense of belonging and moral certainty that is highly seductive. It is easier to unite in hatred of a common enemy than to do the difficult work of looking at one's own group's shadow. The only vaccine against this collective psychic infection is individual consciousness. The work of withdrawing one's own projections, of integrating one's own shadow, is a radical political act. An individual who becomes aware of their own capacity for evil is far less likely to be swept away by mass hysteria. They develop a psychological immunity to propaganda and demonization. They are able to see the humanity with its light and its shadow in both their own group and in the other. In an era of growing fragmentation and conflict, shadow work ceases to be merely a journey of personal self-discovery and becomes an urgent necessity for the survival and sanity of our civilization. Recognizing the existence of the shadow is the first step, but how can we, in practice, begin a dialogue with this feared part of ourselves? Depth psychology offers tools that are not prescriptions, but invitations to exploration, true navigational arts for the waters of the unconscious. The first and most fundamental tool is dream analysis. Jung considered dreams the royal road to the unconscious, the pure, uncensored language of the soul. In dreams, the shadow often appears as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, possessing characteristics that the ego consciousness rejects. It might be a criminal, an outcast, an envious sibling, a primitive figure. Instead of fearing or dismissing this figure, the work consists of dialoguing with it, asking, "Who are you? What do you want? What message do you bring me?" Writing down dreams and reflecting on these shadow figures is the beginning of a conscious relationship with our hidden side. A second powerful tool is active imagination. Unlike passive daydreaming, active imagination is a method of conscious meditation where one allows images from the unconscious to rise and develop, while the ego participates as an active interlocutor. One can start with a mood, an image from a dream, or a physical pain, and allow it to take on a personality. Then, a dialogue with this figure begins. It is a process of giving voice to the parts of us that have been silenced. It is in the drama of this interaction that the repressed energy of the shadow can be understood and transformed, revealing its purpose and potential. A third practice, more applicable to daily life, is mindful attention to triggers. As we've seen, projections are revealed by our intense emotional reactions. The practice consists of, in the moment you feel triggered by someone, resisting the impulse to react and instead turning your attention inward. Ask yourself, what part of me is feeling so activated right now? What does this situation remind me of? What old wound has been touched? This act of sitting with the trigger transforms a potentially destructive interaction into an opportunity for self-knowledge. It is an exercise in real-time alchemy. Furthermore, creative expression, whether through writing, painting, dancing, or music, can be a safe channel for the shadow to manifest. Often, we cannot intellectually articulate what the shadow contains, but we can allow it to express itself symbolically through art. Creating without censorship, allowing the ugly, the chaotic, and the grotesque to emerge, can be incredibly cathartic and revealing. These tools are not quick fixes. They require patience, courage, and above all, self-compassion. The goal of dialoguing with the shadow is not to defeat or control it, but to listen to it with respect. It is a process of internal diplomacy, of negotiating peace between the divided kingdoms of our own psyche. In doing so, we not only neutralize its destructive capacity, but also release the immense creative energy it contains, putting it at the service of our wholeness. The act of withdrawing one's own projections is one of the most challenging and disorienting processes of the psychological journey. It is a true perceptual detox for years, perhaps a lifetime. We have built our reality and our identity on the foundation of blaming others, of seeing the world through the filter of our internal dramas. Dismantling this structure is like demolishing the house we have always lived in. It is necessary. but it leaves us temporarily exposed, vulnerable, and without bearings. The first stage of this process is grieving one's own innocence. We have to abandon the comfortable narrative in which we were the victims or the righteous heroes. We must face the painful truth that we were, to a large extent, the co-creators of our own conflicts. We have to admit our own participation, our own pettiness, our own negativity. This recognition can bring a wave of shame and guilt. It is crucial to get through this phase without drowning in self-condemnation, understanding that projection is a universal human mechanism, not a personal character flaw. The second stage is disillusionment with others. As we withdraw our projections, both negative and positive, the people around us shrink to their real, human size. The tyrannical boss may be revealed as just an insecure man. The idealized partner may turn out to be an ordinary person with qualities and flaws. The guru we idolized may have their own problems and contradictions. This fall of the idols can be lonely and sad. The world loses some of its epic drama and becomes more ambiguous, grayer, more complex. We lose the simplistic clarity of good versus evil. This phase requires the ability to tolerate ambiguity and complexity. The third stage is the radical assumption of responsibility. If the other is no longer the cause of my anger, my unhappiness, or my frustration, then the responsibility falls entirely on me. This realization can be, at first, terrifying. It deprives us of all excuses. There is no one left to blame. All the energy that was once spent criticizing, complaining, and fighting against others must be redirected to inner work. It is the moment to ask, if the source of the problem is within me, what can I do to change? This is the transition from reactive powerlessness to creative power. The reward for going through this painful detox is immense. It is freedom, freedom from the tyranny of emotional reactions, freedom to see people as they are, allowing authentic relationships to finally flourish, freedom to use our psychic energy not in external wars, but in building a life that is a true reflection of who we are in our totality. Withdrawing projections is the act of growing up psychologically, of leaving the ego's kindergarten, where there is always someone to blame, and entering the soul's maturity, where there is only the responsibility and the freedom to be the author of one's own experience. The journey of integrating the shadow culminates in a fundamental alchemical transformation, the transmutation of the lead of judgment into the gold of compassion. This is not a sentimental or superficial compassion, but a quality of being that emerges from the direct, visceral experience of our own human complexity. As long as we operate from an idealized persona and a denied shadow, our primary tool for interacting with the world is judgment. Judgment is the blade we use to dissect reality, separating everything into categories of good and bad, right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable. We do this to protect our fragile identity, to keep the shadow at a distance. By judging others, we reinforce the belief in our own righteousness. However, when we begin the work with the shadow, this blade begins to turn inward. We are forced to confront our own capacity for cruelty, dishonesty, cowardice, exactly the qualities we once condemned so vehemently in others. We experience firsthand how difficult it is to be consistent, how easy it is to succumb to temptation, how deeply we are all wounded and conditioned. This experience breaks us. It shatters our pedestal of moral superiority. It is from this brokenness, this humiliation of the ego, that true compassion can be born. The compassion that emerges from this process is not condescension pour him, it is recognition. When we look at another in their mistake, in their failure, in their darkness, we no longer see a monster or a stranger. We see ourselves. We recognize the same potential, the same struggle, the same shared humanity. The judgmental phrase, "How could he do that?" transforms into the compassionate question, what led him to do that? What pain, what fear, what ignorance lies behind that action? This is the concept of the wounded healer. Only one who is aware of their own wounds can truly help heal the wounds of others. One who believes themselves to be healthy and perfect can only judge and prescribe. One who knows their own shadow can offer a non-judgmental space where healing can happen. Compassion then becomes the natural expression of wholeness. We stop seeing the world as a courtroom and start seeing it as a field hospital, where everyone, without exception, is dealing with their own battles and wounds. This does not mean condoning destructive behavior. On the contrary, true compassion can be fierce, setting firm boundaries against what is harmful. But it does so not from a place of moral superiority, but from a deep understanding of the dynamics of pain. It is the difference between amputating a limb with hatred and performing surgery with the aim of saving a life. The blade of judgment separates and kills. The embrace of compassion recognizes, contains, and enables transformation. What is life like for one who has passed through the fire of confronting the shadow and begun the process of integration? It is not an arrival at a state of perpetual happiness or effortless enlightenment. That is a fantasy of the persona. Life after integration is, in fact, a life of paradox, of complexity, and of far greater depth. It is the transition from a two-dimensional existence to a three-dimensional one. The first fruit of integration is authenticity. When we stop spending an immense amount of energy repressing half of who we are, that energy becomes available for life. There is less fear of being found out, as there is nothing left to hide. We can be vulnerable without feeling weak. We can be strong without becoming tyrants. Our actions, words, and relationships begin to emanate from a more cohesive and true center. The mask of the persona becomes more transparent and flexible, used as a tool for social interaction rather than a hiding place. The second fruit is a sense of humor. One who has confronted their own shadow develops a deep sense of humor about the human condition, starting with their own. The ability to laugh at oneself, at one's own contradictions and pretensions, is a sign of great psychic health. Ego inflation and solemn self-importance are replaced by a lightness and humility born from the recognition of our fallible and paradoxical nature. The third fruit is a significant increase in creativity. The shadow is a reservoir of primordial, instinctual, and chaotic energy. When this energy is consciously integrated, it becomes the fuel for creative expression, art, innovation, the ability to find new solutions to old problems. All of this flourishes when we have access to the totality of our psyche, both its ordered side logos and its chaotic, creative side eros. Life becomes less predictable, but much more alive. Finally, the integration of the shadow leads us to a new kind of relationship with life. We stop seeking certainty and learn to live with uncertainty. We stop striving for perfection and learn to find beauty in imperfection. We develop a fundamental trust, what Jung would call trust in the self, the ordering center of the psyche, that we can handle whatever life presents us with, because we know we possess both the light and the darkness necessary to navigate any situation. To live in paradox is to be able to be, at the same time, gentle and firm, spiritual and earthy, serious and playful, solitary and connected. It is to abandon the tyranny of either or and embrace the wisdom of both. And it is the realization that the goal of life is not to eliminate conflict, but to learn to contain it within a larger consciousness, transforming the tension of opposites into the very force that propels the soul's continuous growth.